When the news broke that Damian Lillard had officially requested a trade from the Blazers, it sent shockwaves through the league. But unfortunately, it wasn't a real trade request. It was a trade demand. Get me to Miami or I'm not taking the court. And given the leverage we've seen in the hands of the players over the last few years, everyone expected him to get that wish. But then it just didn't happen. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and when it finally did, it wasn't the trade we were expecting. Instead, we see one that would affect nearly every single title contender like no trade has ever done before, completely shifting the league's landscape and future overnight. This really isn't an exaggeration. A few days ago, the odds vary site to site, but the Milwaukee Bucks were consensuously given the 4th best title odds, just behind the Nuggets, Celtics, and Suns, usually around plus 800 or 8-1. The second this trade happened, that was cut in half. They currently sit as the title favorites at plus 390. The last time we saw a trade jump a team to title favorites was when Paul George went to the Clippers, but that was a trade that didn't have nearly the widespread implications on the rest of the league that this trade does. And another big difference between that deal and this one is that a majority of Milwaukee's core is already a championship group, which allows us to paint a much better picture of what we can come to expect. Now technically, this was 2 separate deals, but effectively it's a 4-team deal and eventually will likely be a 5-teamer. The Bucks are getting Damian Lillard. The Blazers are getting DeAndre Ayton, Robert Williams, Malcolm Brogdon, a Bucks 2029 first-round pick unprotected, the right to swap with them in 2028 and 2030, a Warriors 2024 first, and a Celtics 2029 first unprotected. The Suns get Yusuf Nurkic, Grayson Allen, Nassir Little, and Keon Johnson, and the Celtics get Jrue Holiday. A truly beautiful trade no matter how you slice it. Now for Milwaukee, is there some risk? Absolutely. We tend to forget this, but Damian Lillard is not young at all, at least in terms of basketball. He's 33. For some context, if he managed to eclipse 30 points a game this season, as he did a year ago, he'd be just the 2nd player at that age to do that, along with LeBron. At the point guard position, there's only been 2 players to even average 25 at 33, that being Steph Curry and Jerry West. Flash forward 2 years, the age 35 season. Not a single point guard has come into the season at that age and reached that mark. A vast majority are a shell of even their 33-year-old self. Where Lillard is today, throughout NBA history, is typically marked as the beginning of the end. Now with that said, it is starting to change. Curry's going to turn 36 during this season. LeBron and Chris Paul are nearing 40. The Damian Lillard we last saw shows no signs of impending fall, but it is a factor we need to include. Then when you look closer at this current roster, there is a very real doomsday scenario. Lillard's locked up, he's got a player option in 2027 worth a whopping $63 million, but he's the only player currently under contract that far into the future. Giannis, including this season, has 2 years left on his current deal. Chris Middleton just inked a new deal this offseason that'll keep him around for the next 2 seasons with a player option after that. Brook Lopez also just got a new contract for the next 2 seasons. Bobby Portis, like Middleton, is on a 2+1. And speaking of age, Middleton is 32, riddled with injuries lately. Lopez is 35, which is scary territory, especially at his size. He's coming off being a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, something few if any have managed at that age. No one believes that changes overnight, but come the end of this contract, chances are we're talking about a much different player. Now, it's not like Holiday is younger than Lillard. They're the same age. But we bring all this up to emphasize this trade did not create the league's next dynasty. Far from it. This was a pure win-now move that makes the final years of that Giannis contract a lot more exciting, but the years following a lot more concerning. There won't be a window of time post this current core and when you've got to give Portland all these picks to build through the draft, as this is not the first time they cashed in all their draft capital. From trading for Jrue Holiday a few years back, here's their pick situation. The Pelicans can swap in 2024. Either the Pelicans or Knicks have their pick in 25. The Pelicans can swap in 26. The Pelicans have their pick unprotected in 2027, and now with this Lillard trade have given up the upside or the pick entirely from 2028 to 2030. Yes, every single pick from now to the end of this decade has been traded at least in some capacity. In order for them to avoid handing over at least a couple top picks, they're not only going to need to retain Giannis for this entire stretch of time, but Obi continues to dominate into his mid-30s while having consistent success in free agency as they're projected to have little to no trade assets. That's the risk. We had to put it out there, but to be very clear, they made a great trade. In a scenario like the one they're in, you've got to make a move while you still can. Blockbuster trades, especially those involving players at this age with picks this far into the future, become scary when too much projection is involved. And certainly when that projection involves a young roster breaking out before they've even done that. The DeJounte Murray, Rudy Gobert, Donovan Mitchell trades, for example. There's a lot of risk and even questions surrounding the effectiveness of moves like that. Those trades made fringe play-in teams marginally better. They didn't make their team title favorites in mere minutes, which, as mentioned, this trade did. And for good reason. The Bucks have a lot of evidence, even within their own team, to support just how impactful this trade at least has a chance to be. Their big three moves in the Giannis era have all centered around the point guard position. After winning 42 games the year prior, they trade for Eric Bledsoe in 2017, a move that brings them to 44 wins in the first year, but then they take off in 2019, winning 60, then 56 in 2020. And so, seeing noticeable drop-offs from Bledsoe between the regular and postseasons, they decide to move on, but double down on the success they found with a two-way point guard at the helm. They give up that massive package for Holiday ahead of the 2021 season, someone that looked like the missing piece. They win a title in the very first season with him on the team. But now 2 years removed from that title, we know that isn't really the case. We first need to remember the pathway to that title, one of the more favorable pathways we've seen in a very long time, and one they're not going to be able to expect to see again. The Nets take down Boston in the first round and match up with Milwaukee. Brooklyn loses Kyrie and Harden for portions of the series, yet it still takes the Bucks a Game 7 victory in overtime by just 4 points to advance. Then they get to play the Atlanta Hawks, a team in the middle of this Cinderella run after eliminating Philly with the help of a complete collapse out of Ben Simmons. The West is riddled with injuries, so it's this young Suns team that matches up with them in the finals, a team that didn't even make the playoffs the year prior, but after trading for Chris Paul make a great run. The Suns at that time are by no means the caliber team you can expect to see in the finals most seasons. Since then, Milwaukee failed at Boston in the conference semis, and most recently in the first round to the Miami Heat. So what's Jrue Holiday done in that time? His 3 regular seasons have been incredible. Nearly 19 points, 7 assists and 5 rebounds, shooting 49% from the field and 40% from 3, all while being considered one of the league's premier perimeter defenders. If that's the Jrue Holiday Milwaukee was getting in the playoffs, this trade would not have happened. But reality is that is not who they got. This almost seems made up, but he goes from a nearly 50-40 player in the regular season to less than 40% from the field and 33% from 3 in the 40 playoff games we've seen with him in Milwaukee. Outside of a favorable matchup against Atlanta, this was the efficiency we were seeing from him series after series. Then on the other end, where he's really supposed to make his impact, while there's still no question he's a premier defender even in the playoffs, he's fresh off some serious struggles matching up with Jimmy Butler in their most recent series. It's clear they're not going to be able to chalk him up as this shutdown defender in the postseason year in and year out, especially as his age gets up there. With that being the case, knowing that it's nearly impossible to fall to defensive mediocrity as long as you have this Giannis Lopez frontcourt, knowing that you also now have some serious question marks surrounding your perimeter scoring given Chris Middleton's health, when you get a chance to bring in one of the better scorers in league history, you do it. The risk is pretty much irrelevant. We often forget how rare an opportunity comes along to win a title. Before 2021, they hadn't won a title since 1971. Over a third of the league haven't won a single title. Now again, that doesn't mean just because a move might put you in that position, you do it. If those scenarios are still possible a year, 2 years, 3, 4 years from then, you have to factor in the risk of giving up draft capital nearly a decade into the future. Handing over top pick after top pick is a tough price to pay for impatience. We'll likely be asking Matt Ishbia about that fairly soon. But the Bucks aren't in that position. Giannis isn't 24 anymore. He's got 2 years left on this current contract and has been flirting with the idea of a change of scenery more than ever. As mentioned, the core around him is an elderly bunch by NBA standards. The championship window was shrinking by the minute, and once it's closed, if their history repeated itself, wouldn't come around for nearly 30 years. So while the Bucks were contenders even prior to the Lillard trade, when you get an opportunity to double your title odds overnight at the cost of a more concerning future that was probably bleak anyways, you do it. It's also starting to seem as if Giannis was using his upcoming free agency to pressure the Bucks into making a move like this. No one ever questioned his loyalty to the franchise really until recently, when he hadn't been ruling out a future on another team in interviews. This is also a move he might have been slowly working on behind the scenes for a while now. Take a look at this clip from the All-Star game.
First pick gonna be Damian Lillard.
See, Giannis has changed this weekend. You know, he always talk about loyalty and being loyal.
I know who my
and
team
all of that
is,
stuff, right? So I don't know what's going on with Giannis. Okay, you messed my whole draft board.
Then when the trade happens and the PR team is so quick to come out and make sure everyone knows they didn't tell Giannis about the trade due to Jrue Holiday's involvement, it raises even more suspicion about his role in this move. But that's really aside the point. We'll go down that rabbit hole at a later date. The trade's been done, And out of all the potential scenarios, it's hard to imagine a much better one than this. I saw this on Twitter this morning, and it's really opened your eyes to what kind of move we're dealing with here. For context, most of you are probably familiar, but true shooting percentage is basically field goal percentage weighted to encompass the value of threes and free throws. The league average at the point guard position is right around 56%. Well, Jrue Holiday, with the help of getting to the line just 2 times a game, had a true shooting percentage in the playoffs this year of 49%. That ranks 78th of the 90 qualified guards, in the same ballpark as Dillon Brooks. Jordan Poole was shooting 65%. What's even crazier though is that this is the best playoff true shooting Holiday has posted with the Bucks. In fact, in the Giannis era, they've consistently had terrible scoring production out of their starting point guard, the best coming from Eric Bledsoe in 2018, who was still far below league average. They're going from that to Damian Lillard, someone that was 3rd in the entire league in scoring this past season. He averaged 33, while shooting with the 4th best true shooting of any guard playing at least 20 minutes. Sure, there's room to be cautious. For most of Lillard's career, he's been a notorious playoff disappointment. But that's a sentiment that's been fading with his last few outputs. Most recently in 2021, when he averaged 34 and 10 on 46, 45, 94 splits. This situation is also unlike anything Lillard's experienced in his entire career. At the top of his list of NBA teammates is a back-to-the-basket power forward LaMarcus Aldridge and an undersized fellow defensive liability CJ McCollum. Now he's joining the best defensive front in the league, led by a 2-time MVP. He's joining a team with actual floor spacing at the 5, and if healthy, a team that has one of the league's premier wing scorers. But what's really so fascinating here is not just the direct impact of Lillard's personal scoring production, but the impact his presence will have on an offense that has someone as physically dominant as Giannis is. Everyone's really excited about the Giannis-Lillard pick and roll, and rightfully so, but he has a few other key abilities that are really going to cause some problems. The first of which being his ability off the ball. Playing with CJ McCollum and later Anfernee Simons, he's proven to be one of the best off-ball point guards in the entire league, especially of those scoring with high volume. This is vital for maximizing what you can get out of a Giannis offense. And then the shooting, and not just the shooting at some of the highest volume in the league, only matched by a handful of players, but the space it generates, what the kids call now gravity. His three-point range is really only rivaled by Steph Curry. Now, no player is really that efficient from these absurd distances, but that doesn't mean defenses don't respect it. Lillard's willingness to shoot from these absurd ranges bring up the defense the second he passes the half-court line, whether he has the ball or not. This generates a lot of opportunity elsewhere, but that kind of space can only add so much to an offense of Jeremy Grant and Anfernee Simons. Good players, but we're now talking about a team with Giannis Antetokounmpo. The defensive effort that comes along with stopping Giannis creates offensive space for Lillard he's yet to see in his decade-long career. Milwaukee truly has a chance to have an offense unlike anything we've ever seen before. Now, nothing's a guarantee. Putting them ahead of Denver, with the dominance they just displayed in the playoffs while rotating their entire starting lineup, is a little aggressive, but it's understandable. The trade also makes Milwaukee's decisions from earlier in the offseason interesting to look back at. Their big moves were just bringing back Middleton and Lopez, but that wasn't guaranteed. In fact, retaining both felt unlikely. Reportedly, Brook Lopez had the Houston Rockets convinced they agreed on a deal. So much so, they made a trade to free up the ability to sign him before he went back on it and returned to Milwaukee. Then they were put in a tough spot with Middleton's free agency. Coming off a series of injuries, it was hard to know what you were going to get going forward, likely meaning he wasn't worth a max contract. But if they didn't give it to him, someone else would, so their hand was forced. Then they made some small moves like signing Malik Beasley to a 1-year deal. So when you really look back at this, they were just a couple decisions away from losing Brook Lopez, trotting out Giannis, Holiday, and Chris Middleton, who you might have to temper your expectations for given the player we last saw. But instead, they're heading into this season as the odds-on favorite to win the title. They could be looking at a rotation of something like Damian Lillard, Chris Middleton, one of Pat Connaughton, Jay Crowder, and Malik Beasley, Giannis, Lopez, Bobby Portis off the bench, and they actually still have some exciting young pieces with Marjon Beauchamp and Ty Washington. They are clear winners, and usually for every winner, there's a loser. But I'm not sure that's the case with this trade, at least for the teams directly involved. You've got to commend the Blazers. They were really trying to be loyal and build around Lillard despite it making no sense on paper. They publicly explored trading the 3rd overall selection in the draft, but when the offers weren't enough, they didn't pull the trigger out of desperation. And even once they made a selection, they still were clearly committed to avoiding a rebuild, re-signing Jeremy Grant to a massive extension. And then when Lillard officially requests out, they try to get him to his desired destination, more specifically, the Miami Heat. But they don't concede. They don't let Lillard have all the leverage and eventually settle for pennies on the dollar. Then as we got closer and closer to the regular season, it was becoming more and more clear that the Miami Heat weren't bringing a competitive offer to the table. And while reports suggest Lillard was willing to come back if he couldn't go to the Heat, at that point it was too late. Suddenly half the league is in trade talks, and eventually they settle on this deal with Milwaukee and Phoenix, somehow actually getting proper value, maybe even more than they should have. One of their top additions from the trade was former first overall pick in the draft, Deandre Ayton. Someone that at best is marginally better than the center they gave up in this deal, Jusuf Nurkic, but Nurkic is heading into his 30s with 3 years left on his contract. By the time this team's hopefully ready to compete with Scoot Henderson at the helm, Jusuf is likely bringing little to no value, if even on the team at all. Deandre Ayton, on the other hand, like Nurkic, has 3 years left on his deal, but unlike Nurkic, is just 24 years old. He does fit the timeline of this group, allowing him to hopefully become a foundational part of this team well past his current contract. Then they also get Jrue Holiday, which initially caused many to question the package at first glance, wondering if they got enough or how it wasn't comparable to what the Heat were willing to offer. A sentiment that was mostly stemming from a misunderstanding of Herro's value, especially compared to Holiday. While we just ripped into his playoff scoring production, he does carry a lot of value, and that became evident when you see what Portland flipped him for, sending him to Boston for the Warriors pick next year, a great young big in Robert Williams on one of the best contracts in the league. Malcolm Brogdon, who it looks like they'll trade again for even more draft capital. By the time you're seeing this, he could have easily already been traded, and the Celtics first rounder in 2029, completely unprotected. So now compare this entire Lillard return to what they could have potentially gotten from the Heat. Something like Tyler Herro, Duncan Robinson, or Kyle Lowry, 2028 and 2030 first, some pick swaps, and maybe Jaime Jaquez, giving up just Lillard. Not only is that just a worse package, but the Heat also didn't have the means to facilitate that Ayton-Nurkic side of the deal. And when talking about trades, we often talk about these first round picks as if they're all built the same. That is far from the case. In fact, that also needs to be considered comparing the advantage of bringing in someone like Jrue Holiday to Tyler Herro. If you look at the median projection of teams come 2030 when some of these picks will happen, obviously you're expecting teams building strong young cores and stockpiling picks like OKC, San Antonio, Utah, and Brooklyn to be towards the top of the league. But aside from those teams with assets stretching that far into the future, the Miami Heat are one of the few teams you don't expect to be rebuilding at the bottom, as long as Pat Riley and Eric Spoelstra have been with this organization, which is going on 30 years now, they've been the model of consistency, notoriously using very little draft capital at all, setting themselves up for big free agency moves, and consistently creating value from undervalued or undrafted players with one of the best development staffs in the league. With Spoelstra, they've only finished below 40 wins twice, and while they've been blessed with names like Wade, Bosh, LeBron, and now Jimmy Butler, there's real reason to believe this will be a continued trend rather than just a coincidence, given the reputation of this organization and playing in possibly the most sought-after market, quite the opposite of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So if you're getting the upside from a team's pick 7 years into the future, you're gonna want to take the bet on the Bucks over the Heat every day of the week. Sure, there's scenarios where Giannis sticks around and continues to dominate into his mid-30s, making these picks all not that valuable. But if you were to simulate from now till 2028, 2029, 2030, more often than not, they'd be giving Portland at least one top selection, then Tyler Herro compared to Jrue Holiday. While on paper the package the Blazers could have gotten back might have been similar, the suitors would have been completely different. In all likelihood, Herro would have gone to a much younger team with a future much more secure compared to the teams in the market for someone like Holiday. Getting a first rounder in 2029 from a team like San Antonio is a lot less valuable than a team like Boston. Now, it isn't impossible that the Celtics are still competitive by then. They actually have Jaylen Brown on contract that season and could easily get Tatum locked up on a similar time frame. But just like Milwaukee, recently they've been consolidating their assets into more win-now contributors. Even in this trade, they're giving up a 25-year-old center for a 33-year-old point guard. Derek White has 2 years left on his contract. Al Horford's one of the oldest players in the league. And Jason Tatum, while right now no one really expects him to be going anywhere, only has 2 years left on his contract. Now, their future doesn't necessarily look bleak, but it is a lot less secure than most teams, making that 2029 pick fairly valuable. And this is on top of whatever you get back from Brogdon and the value of Robert Williams, who it doesn't seem like they'll be quick to move, but they'll likely have to consider it given that they have DeAndre Ayton, and right now they could get a ton for him on his present contract. On his next, presumably much higher contract, it's tough to say. Between this deal and the original Lillard deal, they're clearly taking a strong bet on the eventual downfall of these teams currently at the top. But even right now, they've got a really promising group. It's rare you see a player the caliber of Damian Lillard get traded from a team that's been stacking up young talent like the Blazers have been. They now sit with this young backcourt of Scoot Henderson, Anthony Simons, Shaedon Sharpe. In the frontcourt, they've got guys like Ayton, Robert Williams, Chris Murray. They also just gave contracts to Matisse Thybulle and Jeremy Grant, guys they could decide to trade soon, but also set the stage for an interesting scenario, where if Scoot Henderson is this transcendent talent many expect, or if guys like Sharpe and Ayton break out, this team isn't in the rebuild timeline you usually come to expect. A contract like Grant's would be crippling to a lot of teams if it's truly as hard to trade as many suspect it would be. But for Portland, it really isn't. There's nothing to cripple, at least till all these guys get past their rookie contracts. Now, you do have to have some serious question marks about this specific group of players together, but right now that's irrelevant. We don't even fully know what they have with some of these guys. They truly managed to get a better return than pretty much anyone expected. It was legitimately impressive, but let's not give Joe Cronin in this front office too much credit. Wasting away rarely seen a decade-long loyalty from one of the best players in the league is impressively bad. It'll be interesting to see what changes in the post-Lillard era. Then there's the side of the trade that's starting to seem the most controversial: the Phoenix Suns. When just looking at this specific trade, they made a great move, but that's given the situation they put themselves in. The Kevin Durant trade was questionable to say the least. They gave up pretty much the Lillard package, plus Mikal Bridges, who closed the year averaging an efficient 26, and even prior, they could have flipped for 4 or 5 more first rounders. This was for a 34-year-old Kevin Durant. The team was already competing at the top of the league, and with Chris Paul likely on his way out, had a core 4 all 27 years or younger. Before that trade, they were contenders, but not the favorite. After the trade, they were contenders, but not the favorite. It's just now they had no long-term assets to speak of, even down to their second-round selections. The urgency and impatience from new owner Matt Ishbia was just unnecessary. This isn't baseball, where as long as you're willing to keep spending, you're gonna be fine. But nonetheless, the trade was made. Then this offseason, they get Bradley Beal for pennies on the dollar as a product of his no-trade clause. They now clearly have the top-end talent: Durant, Beal, Booker, Ayton. The problem, though, the list of players under contract pretty much ended there, leaving them to have to fill out their roster with a bunch of minimum contracts. A bunch of players that was getting everyone excited and going because of their name rather than the player that they actually are. Now, to be fair, their options were limited to say the least. They bring in a 34-year-old Eric Gordon, take a flyer on Bol Bol, bring in corner 3 sniper Watanabe, a solid master of none in Jrue Eubanks. Easily their most exciting addition was Bates Diop from the Spurs, but keep in mind that 3-and-D presence everyone is looking at him as isn't as guaranteed as it might seem. While he shot 39% from 3 last season, that was on very low volume, and he's a career less than 34% three-point shooter. Nonetheless though, a great pickup. Then they still had some role players around like Damian Lee and Josh Okogie. They did what they could, but this was easily the worst supporting cast of any of the contenders. Coming out of free agency, it was pretty surprising to see their Vegas odds and the public perception surrounding their title chances. The offense was going to be there was no questions about that. But that was the case even in the playoffs last year. Adding in Bradley Beal doesn't mean you're smacking on his 23 points a game to their current output. We just saw historic levels of production from Durant and Booker in the playoffs, combining for an efficient 60. Bringing in Bradley Beal and assembling the league's most feared trio of mid-range monsters is fun. You got Beal for basically free, you don't not do that. But it was hard to see how that shifted their title odds in any significant way. The problem staring them in the face a year ago didn't go anywhere, that being depth and defense. Now, depth is one of the more overused or I guess misunderstood talking points in this sport. No value comes from having a great 10th man, at all. Come the playoffs, most teams don't even want a 10-man rotation. Depth really comes from having players both in the starting unit and off the bench being able to slot into multiple positions. For example, the Nuggets with Aaron Gordon, Bruce Brown, and Jeff Green. The Lakers with Rui, Vanderbilt, and LeBron. The Warriors with Wiggins, Draymond, and Otto Porter in their most recent title run. For most of their decade-long dominance, Andre Iguodala. The Bucks in 2021 with Giannis, Bobby Portis, and PJ Tucker. All those guys vary in terms of size and role and quality as player, but it is those types of players that translate to depth, especially for top-heavy teams as Phoenix is. Coming out of free agency, they didn't have this. Bates, Diop, and Durant were bringing some versatility at those forward spots, but that was pretty much it. This team was going to be depending way too much on Jrue Eubanks, Eric Gordon, and Josh Okogie minutes. We just saw some of their role players in the playoffs. Josh Okogie is a solid perimeter defender, but gave them a nearly unplayable 2 points, shooting 31% from the field in that Denver series. The same series where Damian Lee averaged 2 points on 29-11 splits. And the same series that saw Deandre Ayton struggles turn into a $32 million contract for Jock Landale. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen a roster make up somewhat like this. Just a couple years ago, we saw one in Brooklyn that also had Kevin Durant. They dominated on the back of their historic levels of offensive production when they could get all three of Durant, Harden, and Kyrie on the court together. If they were able to stay healthy, they likely would have won that title in 2021, considering just how close they were to taking down the Bucks and the pathway the Bucks ended up having. But that Nets roster really isn't as similar to this Suns team as it seems at first glance. Not only is it an arguably better trio that had these correlating skill sets that created a unique scenario where all three were able to maintain insane levels of individual production, but they also had a core around that group that was much stronger than we gave it credit for at the time, and clearly much stronger than the Suns are dealing with now. Nick Claxton, Jeff Green, and Bruce Brown, two players we just saw the value they can bring to a championship rotation. Joe Harris and Blake Griffin, who somehow turned back the clock and caught fire to close the year. It was that core, surrounding a big three, combining for well over 70 points on like 50, 40, 90. Will this Suns trio be able to match that? It's hard to say, but it would probably have to be the baseline in order to reach those championship goals considering the supporting cast. But then this trade happens, and things are a little bit more interesting. Joining in on the Lillard trade, they ship out DeAndre Ayton and in the process bring in Jusuf Nurkic, Grayson Allen, Nassir Little, and Keon Johnson. This is a great move. Well, again, a great move considering that value or the future is already out the door. The chips are in the middle. Any move they make should only be looked at through the lens of what it brings them right now. Just take a look at this trade combined with that Durant deal. They gave up Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, DeAndre Ayton, first rounders in 2023, 25, 27, 29, and a swap in 28 for Durant, Nurkic, Nassir Little, and Grayson Allen. That's insane, but since they're clearly all in, while Ayton's future is bright, it doesn't really matter. Right now, he's only marginally better than Nurkic at best, and a case can actually be made that the extra 40 pounds for Nurkic gives them a better chance at getting past the boogeyman in Denver. Now, Nurkic has struggled to stay on the court, which definitely adds some more risk here, but it's not like Ayton's been an Iron Man either. Then they get Grayson Allen and Nassir Little, which is really what makes this a huge win for them. Allen's a solid pickup. He is a little deceiving, but nonetheless, a solid pickup. Many see him coming from a top defensive unit and is drama-filled, tripping past, and look at him as someone bringing defense. That's not happening. He's neutral at best on that end. What he is bringing is reliable offensive production and floor spacing he's proven capable of maintaining into the playoffs. What's also nice about someone like Allen is scalability as a scorer, something that doesn't exist for guys like Diop, Okogie, Lee, Watanabe. Whether it's injury or whatever the case may be and you need role players to step up, they can get that from Allen. It's not ideal, but he can raise his volume somewhat effectively, similar to what you see from guys like Josh Hart and Malik Beasley when the opportunity arises. Then there's Nassir Little, another solid pickup, but also another guy that is getting a little too much credit, mainly defensively, given the player he was projected to be as a prospect and his ridiculous physical profile that features a 7'2" wingspan. It's somewhat similar to the narratives you see surrounding a player like Jonathan Kuminga, but given what this team was dealing with, this is a huge addition. He can come in and slide in with Durant at either one of the forward spots, but the value you're really hoping he brings is to the rotation as a whole. You're hoping he can bring what Rui brought to the Lakers a year ago. Rui was not getting $51 million had he stayed with the Wizards. That is a fact. He was had at the deadline for a couple of second-round picks. He wasn't looked at as an elite defender or scorer anywhere on the court. But in his newfound role, especially once bringing in Jared Vanderbilt, it unearthed this value that no one realized he had. He was switching positions constantly across the Lakers' entire playoff run. He was the first guy off the bench. It didn't matter if it was AD, Vanderbilt, or LeBron. He might not have been bringing equal value across these three positions, but going deeper would have only resulted in sub-15-minute roles for guys like Wenyen Gabriel and Malik Beasley. He was the glue to a consistent rotation. Now, Little and Rui aren't too similar as players. Little is much more comfortable on the wing, and Rui's much more viable at the 5. But there is a chance they bring similar value. They now could be looking at a rotation of something like Beal and Booker, Durant and Diop, Nurkic down low, with Grayson Allen, Nassir Little, and Drew Eubanks as those next three up. Then there's still obviously Eric Gordon, Josh Okogie, Bol Bol, Watanabe, Damian Lee, but those guys all have a very wide range of roles we could see this season. This is a vastly better situation than it looked like was even possible a week ago. Now, the defense is still a clear problem. Keep in mind, a lot of the additions people are excited about in regards to what they could bring defensively are coming from one team, the Portland Trailblazers. Obviously Nurkic and Little, but that's also Drew Eubanks' last stop. All three were playing key roles for a team that was legitimately one of the worst defensive units in the entire league, only rivaled by teams like San Antonio and Houston. Sure, the backcourt there is where the glaring struggles were, but there really isn't any room just to blame the other guys. The other forwards on this team were some of their best defenders in Jeremy Grant, Josh Hart, and later Matisse Thybulle. In fact, you're seeing all this optimism about Nassir Little specifically, but his minutes actually correlated with Portland's worst defensive stretches, finishing the season with the worst defensive war on the entire team, behind guys like Shaedon Sharpe, Kevin Knox, and even Damian Lillard. By no means is that a perfect or all-encompassing stat, but it should factor into your expectations. This is a really solid trade, but seeing how much better some of the other contenders got this week, it's really a trade they just had to make to maintain their current position. That's really what's so fascinating about this whole situation. We've never seen anything like it. A trade that involved 3 of the 4 teams with the top odds at the title and created a new title favorite. For most of the offseason, everyone just thought a Lillard trade was going to add a new threat with Miami. It's really been a devastating series of events for them, losing guys like Strus and Vincent in free agency, then striking out on Lillard and eventually Jrue Holiday, who ended up going to the final team in this deal, the Boston Celtics, who really had a surprising offseason. It's not common you see a team that's competing at the top of the league year in and year out like they have been make this much change to their roster. They lose Grant Williams via a sign and trade with Dallas, then trade for Kristaps Porzingis and move that in the process sees them lose their former Defensive Player of the Year point guard in Marcus Smart. Then most recently, they do this big trade for Jrue Holiday, giving up their defensive anchor Robert Williams and reigning 6th Man of the Year Malcolm Brogdon. We're looking at a much different Boston team this year, and it's really hard to build the case that they didn't vastly improve. When you simplify their offseason, what they did was bring in floor spacing and offense, while sacrificing as little defense as possible. Whether or not this offseason was successful really comes down to a couple key positional swaps. Swapping the combination of Marcus Smart and Malcolm Brogdon for Jrue Holiday, and the combination of Robert Williams and Grant Williams for Kristaps Porzingis. Both Smart and Holiday are some of the best perimeter defenders, but with Holiday, you're getting a lot more size. You're getting someone that can play much more seamlessly alongside Derek White, and you're also getting much more offense. Their playoff numbers don't really suggest that, but Holiday should be able to give them a lot more on that end, as there won't be a lot of individual shot creation demanded of him. Then Robert Williams to Kristaps Porzingis. Both are great rim protectors, but you're undoubtedly losing some defense going to Porzingis. The exciting part though is what you gain, and that's a lot more offense. More importantly, a lot more floor spacing. He's coming off a season shooting 39% from 3 on nearly 6 attempts a game. Robert Williams wasn't giving you any of that. This is huge for a team that's built around a wing duo like Boston is. Now what it really seems like they're losing in these trades is depth. But in reality, they might have actually been too deep. They were struggling to figure out where a guy like Grant Williams fits into the rotation, or how the minutes should be spread between Marcus Smart, Derek White, and Malcolm Brogdon. Now they consolidate into a core 6 that's all bringing them versatility, hopefully allowing for a consistent rotation in the playoffs. White, Holiday in the backcourt, Brown, Tatum on the wing, Kristaps, and Horford in the frontcourt. This just might be the best team we've seen in this Brown Tatum era. We're entering a special season. You've got these clear conference favorites in both conferences, Milwaukee and Boston in the East, Denver and Phoenix in the West, but you still have serious threats beyond them. The Lakers, Warriors, Clippers in the West, a conference where every single game matters. Nearly half the conference is sitting with the same exact Vegas win total. There's definitely not the same quantity of threats in the Eastern Conference, but you've still got teams like Miami, Cleveland, and Philly. Now, while this should produce a really exciting season, something to keep in mind is that a lot of these teams we're mentioning have little to no control of most of their future draft capital, while we're seeing other teams just continuously stockpiling it. This is setting the stage for a future where the league is completely depleted of parity, so cherish it while it's still here.